Hi. In the previous demo, we created a service that can parse this JSON. In this demo, we'll be looking at validating it. Let's go to developer. We still have the service from last time, which will simply parse the JSON. Let's run it again to make sure it still works. Okay, so we have our devices. And we want to start validating. The temperature is expressed in Celsius, so we could at least define that the temperature should not be below 273, approximately. So let's go back to developer. Let's take the devices. And we have the extension here for the temperature. Let's say the min-inclusive should be minus 274. Okay, let's go back to JSON. Let's introduce an error then. Let's say this is minus 300. And let's run this. There's actually no problem at this point. So if you look at the temperature here, we see it's minus 300. But if we enable output validation, we do get an exception. The error being that the value is smaller than allowed. So output validation is very easy to toggle input validation as well to make sure that services have a correct input and output. But the problem here is that this will be thrown as an exception. What if we want to validate but we don't actually want to throw an error? Let's uncheck this again and let's add validate. So we can just take the same output, map it here, and add the validations to the output. If we now run it, we can see that we get an error validation, and we see that the minus 300 is smaller than minus 274. And we do have the path, so we know where the validation problem is. At this point, the service does not really throw an error, it just informs you about the validations. And you can choose at a business level what you want to do with the failed data. Do you want to actually stop, or do you still allow it to pass? There are, however, other ways that the data can be flawed. For example, suppose at this point we just sent ABC. If you look at the definition, we definitely said this should be a number. So if we pass this to JSON, we'll get an exception again. You will see that it cannot parse the value ABC. And this is because we have a hard requirement that this is a number. It is assumed to match that data type. If it doesn't, it will throw an exception because it cannot be parsed. After parsing, we can do additional validation rules, which is what we did here. This is an additional validation rule which does not really stand in the way of parsing. If we want to be more lax in parsing, there is a number of things we can do. For example, we could make this a string instead of a long. Because everything is a string at some point, because this entire JSON is a string, we are definitely sure that the value, whatever it is, can be passed into a string. Let's do the same for the board here. Okay, and if we now parse it, we actually no longer get a validation error. So that's not exactly what we want either. So yes, it's parsed. We now get the ABC here, but it's no longer showing us any validation errors. So what we can actually do now is at this value, we can set an actual type. It's actually long. This is sort of a soft typing where you say, okay, we'll treat it as a string because it's kind of volatile, but we still want to validate it as a number. And at this point, we can see that we cannot parse it, but it's a soft validation error. And again, there's lots of other ways. For example, suppose we don't want to parse the temperatures at all. We could say, let's make a string of it. If we now parse it, we see that the temperatures is simply added as a string without any actual parsing, so no validation errors at all. So what can you validate? There's a number of validation options that stem mostly from XML scheme. So we can check if it's optional or not. We can check if it's a list or not. And for a list, you can even define how many entries it can hold. Depending on the type, what you've selected, you get additional validation options. For example, for numbers, you can check min and max, both inclusive and exclusive. We have length checks. We have pattern checks. There's a lot of other validations that you can add. Apart from all the configurable validation options, you can always add custom business logic to perform any validation you would like. In the next video, I'll be storing this data in a database. Hope it was interesting. See you next time.